Okay. Hi, everybody. And thank you for coming to our Commission on Aging Senior Voices Forum. We are thrilled to be here today, and I personally get very happy when there's a large audience because everything we do, I think, is critically important, provides information that most often is going to be beneficial at least to half of the people here, and we'll take it from there. So before we get into our presentation, I want to go over a few housekeeping pieces of information. So again, welcome. As you know, we do this for you, and for all of you to take the time out of your busy days to come really resonates with the commission. So thank you for that. And thank you to Lucy and everybody else at the library staff who make this room look wonderful and keep us, on our toes with having everything. And our new AV equipment is great because you're the first people to enjoy the updated system. And I will go into greater detail, but Drew Berman and Glen Wagstaff are our presenters today, and you're going to be wowed. I just know it. So I've been talking to them today for the past hour, and there is so much good information. So speaking of information, I do want to introduce some people in the audience, and it's like the Golden Globes, right? If I forget anybody, just please smile and forgive me later. So we have fellow commissioners Carmen Martin and Margie Mullen in the back, and myself, I am one of the two co-chairs, and we have some former commissioners, and I'm going to introduce them because it is important. So Clem, I always say Clem Salibi instead of Salaby. You know I do that. Clem is one of our gold card ladies, and we have Joe Ternurlo in the back. He is a former chair of the commission, and along with myself, we always do the Medicare enrollment. So I hope to see all of you, at least those of you that are of age, to come next year when we do that again. And turn the page, excuse me one second, because there's a lot of information we have on the back table. So we call this our back table items. And when you go back there, it's not just having a little snack and some water. We also have some items. We have a brand new updated gold card participant list. Okay, this just came out actually yesterday. So please, if you're not a gold card member, ask Carmen in the back how you can sign up. It is free to Ridgefield residents. You must be 65 years of age, at least. And thank you. And the gold card gives discounts offered by many merchants and other entities, restaurants in town. We also have, we also have our updated transportation task force flyer. And do I have to move to get this light out of my eye, or thank you? That's better. Okay, sorry about that. And we have our flyer from today, which I'm sure everybody has seen a lot, otherwise you wouldn't be here. If you have any questions, you can always ask us afterwards if it's commission related, town related, and you can always visit the ridgefieldct.gov website to find out what's going on, not just with the Commission on Aging, but all town entities. So what you've been waiting for, our featured events. I'm going to introduce Drew Berman first, and he is, okay, Drew, I wrote it down so I could do you honors. Okay, so Drew is a licensed financial professional, and he will take care of all your needs from debt to retirement and everything in between. And when we're through, when he's through speaking for a few moments, he's going to introduce our attorney, Glen Wagstaff, who is here today, as I said, to help, to educate, to wow, and inform. So, Drew, would you mind coming up? And they also have a PowerPoint presentation, and you're going to run that because I can't. Okay. All right. Thank you very much, everybody, and enjoy. Oh, wait. I'm sorry. One other thing, my little cues here. I do apologize. So what the town is offering again is a free in-person tax preparation service at the Ridgefield Library. There are many flyers in the back like this with the numbers. And Joe, who I mentioned before, he is one of those individuals who will be assisting when you sign up to go have him help you. And again, it's free. Okay, Drew, thank you.
So, Patty, out of all my introductions, that one was by far the most recent. A little nervous talking in front of this crowd. Last time I spoke in front of a crowd, the first time I spoke in front of a crowd this size was in college. And I had prepared and prepared and prepared for this presentation, and my parents drove up, and it was I thought I had done, well, and throughout my presentation, people started leaving one by one. I was getting really upset, and halfway through the presentation, half the room was empty, and I got to the end of the presentation, and there was one guy kind of sitting right where you are, and he stood up and clapped. I said, "Wow, thank you for sticking around to the end." He's like, "I had to stay. I'm the next speaker." So today we're going to have some fun. We're going to talk about wills and trusts and taxes, and we're going to make it fun. Anyone open to turning the boring and the complex into simple and fun? Is that okay? How many of you want to keep more of what you have? Say yes. How many of you want to legally pay less taxes? Say yes. So thank you, Patty. Thank you, Lucy, Margie. Thank you to the town of Connecticut. Thank you for the Ridgefield Library. Thank you for Senior Voices. What goes into these types of productions, the logistics is never easy. It takes a team. So round of applause for Patricia and Margie and her team here. My name is Drew, but most people just call me Drew. And I live here in Ridgefield, 15 years. Came from the city, and I live and work in this great town, and I'm thrilled to be here. And I've gotten to know a couple people throughout, the morning, and I asked a couple people, like, what brought you here? And I met one woman. She's the executive of 3 siblings orders, and one gentleman who's about to sell his home, and one person who's looking to learn a little bit more about Medicaid. So we're going to handle a lot of cool stuff today. But I just want to ask you, what brought you here today? What's one thing you would hope to learn? What brought you here today? Anyone? Yes. What brought you here today? Everyone know what probate is? It's something we want to avoid, right? It costs lots of time and lots of money. So you're going to get to see one of the best in the world on that topic, which is really amazing. So wills, trusts, and probate. Who else? What brought you here today? What's one thing that caught your attention about what? Yes. Oh, the Social Security taxes. That is a very important topic. We will handle that for sure. Who else? One more. Yes. Business owners. How do we use funds legally within our families and our businesses so that we can maximize taxes and law and money? Great question. So we will cover that for sure. So I'm a licensed financial professional. You might have seen this on the back. It's just basically we cover lots of different cool topics, legacy planning and life insurance and annuities and anything from debt to retirement. And I had to take a state exam. So I'm a licensed financial professional. And I got the opportunity to meet Glenn about 4 years ago. And we were at a retreat in Las Vegas, and it was a legal conference. And I was working for an attorney at the time. And the attorney was a very eccentric, successful dude. He was one of 2 out of 1.2 million attorneys that had 2 AmLaw 100 top jury verdicts from 2016 to 2018. And the gentleman was also blind. And he had a company called Unblinded, which was working with a lot of leaders in law, tax, finance, and insurance. And I come from a background of people and marketing. So when I entered the world of law, tax, and finance, it was kind of odd for me. But Glenn called it the triangle of trust, law, tax, and finance. And we work with a team of professionals all over the country who are experts at those things. But oftentimes when we sit with people, we find that their money doesn't properly talk to each other. The legal side of the mortgage protection, of the insurance, of the taxes, how do we make it all work? And that's what I found Glenn to be an expert in. So we were both involved in this top level mastermind, and then Glenn and I decided to work together. And since then, it's been really amazing. We've traveled all over the country doing events like this, sometimes one-on-one, sometimes one on a small group, sometimes on Zoom. And I think there's people watching us from Zoom. Is that right? Yeah. Okay. Well, hello everyone out there in Zoom, and we hope you get some value today. We know you will. Attorney Glenn has been doing this for a long, long time. He's one of the best in the world at this. His company has 51 global awards. He is, I love saying this. This is fun. He's actually a knighted sir. Isn't that cool? Yeah, a knighted sir. He loves it when you call him sir, but you don't have to call him that. You can call him Attorney Glenn. I call him Sir Glenn every morning, but I love it. He's a knighted sir. I've been to his home. He has 5 beautiful kids. And everywhere he travels, every time I talk to him on the phone, he's like, yeah, I just got off the phone with this multimillionaire. I saved them a couple $100,000 on their taxes. Or I just got off the phone with someone retiring and I helped them put together a couple businesses. He always has some wisdom to give. He flew in last night from Utah, and he has business all over the country. Tomorrow we're doing an event like this at a real estate office in New Jersey, and then we're doing 2 back-to-back in Queens on the 15th, which is cool. Glenn, I had the honor of writing the foreword of my book. This is called Go All In. It's a blueprint for wealth, legacy, and financial freedom, where we talk about some of the topics that you're going to hear about today. At the end, we'll answer some questions, and then me and Glenn will be in the back getting to know you and hopefully assisting you on your financial, legal, and tax journey. So that being said, please welcome all the way from Utah. That's right, Utah. Attorney Glen Wagstaff.
All right. Well, Drew, thank you. That introduction was also the most recent that I've ever had. It was fun as I was watching, Patty up here. It was a little intimidating also for me because she looked like she was a judge with her hair and everything, and so I felt like I was in court. But hopefully today we'll be able to cover just some high level, topics that will be of value either to you or to somebody that you know. And if you have questions throughout, feel free to raise your hand, and we'll call on you, and we'll leave some time at the end to talk about topics that maybe are important to you that we don't fully cover here. We're going to share a lot of stories. We're going to share a lot of examples, and hopefully get into some details that will benefit your personal needs, or like I said, somebody that you know. So first question, who's ever met with an estate planning attorney before? Okay, few of us, yeah. Is that like going to the dentist, or is that like, where's it fall in the lineup of, buying a used car, going to the dentist, going to do your taxes? Where's it fall in? Anyone? It's not too bad. It's, if it's done, well, you do it once, you might not have to do it again, right? And hopefully you understand the process, because it's something that's going to affect generations. And a lot of times we postpone these things thinking that it's not that important. But the reality is that it's maybe one of the most important things that we do, right? So we're going to talk a little bit about that. Can we put the PowerPoint up? We're going to talk about some of the aspects of what happens when we get a little bit older and we need to worry about different financial concerns than we might have had when we were younger, right? Oh, perfect. This is a little bit about our firm. We've been around for a while. We have multiple international awards. We've been recognized, all over the country. We have over 100 attorneys in our network, and really we focus on working with seniors. And so one of the things that's very interesting is right now, and somebody even said it when they came in, they said there was this silver tsunami, right? This is the time when really it's most important to plan for what we need in the future, because there's so many of us that are getting to the age where we need to make sure that we're planning for retirement, that we're planning for, long-term care, that we're taking care of, our needs for the future. And the reality is that most of us are not planning around it, as reflected in the statistics, right? So 52% of people turning age 65, this is the statistic, are going to need long-term care services. If you take the full population of everybody in the United States, the statistic says that over 72% of us are going to need long-term care at some point in our lives. That's pretty incredible, right? It says over 34 million of us in the United States have provided unpaid care to an aging adult. And by the way, the largest generation ever of aging adults hasn't even gotten there yet, right? And so it's going to be even more. 65% of adults with long-term care needs relied exclusively on friends and family for their care. And do you think that was by choice or by necessity? By necessity, probably, right? And so, and then finally, you know, we find that a significant portion of the population falls under what we call the sandwich generation, where we're still taking care of younger kids and we're also going to be taking care of aging parents. And so the key to all of this, the reason I share this, is because planning ahead of time will help us to avoid being part of these statistics, right? And having the right things in place help us to avoid the worst of the problems that could come up. So, about this? No. So the things that we're going to talk about today are really focused on 4 different topics. Yeah, I don't know how to get it to work. There it is. The first topic is planning for the future in relation to estate planning. The second, you know, long-term care planning and making sure that we have things in place for our health care needs, right? And again, over 72% of us in the United States are going to need that at some point in our lives. Then we're going to talk a little bit about retirement benefits, Social Security benefits, those sort of things. And then finally, right sizing and what that means and how we do that, right? So some of the basics as it relates to estate planning. And I always like to start with a story because people sometimes don't realize how prevalent this is. And it's not a question of whether you need a plan. It's a question of what kind of plan do you need. It can be very simple or it could be very complex. We work with, you know, the smallest and most simple of situations. We've also worked with some of the most complex situations. We had a situation where there was a family that was in probate for 5.5 years because things hadn't been set up properly. And by the way, they only had one home that mom and dad had left. So it was only one home. It was worth maybe a couple $100,000. And for 5 years, they had to deal with court processes and hearings and all kinds of, you know, problems between siblings and everything else. 5.5 years, right? So sometimes we think this doesn't apply to us. The reality is it applies to everybody, because if you don't have a plan, the state has a plan for you. And sometimes the plan that the state has is not the plan that you want. Does that make sense? And so planning ahead of time, putting things in place really prevents a lot of the bigger problems that could come up by not having those things in place. So let me give you an example, and we'll talk more about this in a little bit, but we had a situation in Texas, husband and wife. The husband had a massive stroke, and the wife, you know, was worried, obviously, wanting to make sure that she's there to take care of the family. They still had a couple teenagers at home, and she assumed that because they're married, that she'd be able to make all the necessary decisions for her husband. Unfortunately, in the state of Texas and in most states, it's not automatic that someone can make decisions for you. So they brought her in 2 days into his hospital stay. They sat her down and they said, your husband did not have a medical directive or a healthcare power of attorney. And because he didn't have that, the hospital will be making all of the medical decisions for your husband until you can go get a conservatorship over him. And she said, well, what's a conservatorship? And they said, well, go talk to an attorney. So she went and found an attorney, and the attorney explained to her that a conservatorship is where you get the legal authority to make decisions on behalf of somebody else, right? So in this case, the husband. So they go through the process, submit the paperwork to the court, and 18 months later, it was approved and she became the conservator. So for 18 months, the hospital made all of the decisions for his care and well-being. And some of those decisions, by the way, the family was not in agreement with. But they didn't have a way to be able to express their wishes or to be able to enforce their rights. Why? Because they didn't have it in writing. So these legal documents might be very simple, but it's the difference between being able to enforce your rights and not being able to enforce your rights, right? And so even a simple healthcare power of attorney or healthcare directive can make the difference between having to end up in court and not having to end up in court, right? So some of the things that, when we talk about estate planning, people don't realize is that estate planning is not just for when you die. It's also if you're alive and you're unable to speak for yourself, right? It could be for planning around taxes or planning around asset protection. It could be for other things that, might be important while you're alive. But a lot of us have emergency situations that come up, and without the right documents in place, those situations just snowball into something bigger and scarier. And just having simple documents can avoid those problems, right? So we'll talk a little bit more about some of those simple documents, but every family needs to have a plan. And the plan may be as simple as a financial power of attorney and a healthcare power of attorney or healthcare directive, right? Or it might be as complex as having multiple structures and multiple trusts and different things in place. And a lot of times we hear people say, well, I got that taken care of because I went online and did a simple will. What's the problem with a will? Anybody? A will, okay, so you need a witness. So there's a process that you need to do to make sure that it's valid. Yeah. If you just have a will, your will go through probate. Why? Because your will is a declaration of your intentions for the court to enforce through a process called probate. If you don't have a will, the court will enforce what are called the laws of intestacy of the state, right? So they have a plan for you if you don't have a plan for yourself. But even if you put your plan down and it's just a will, that will has to be presented to the court so that the court can enforce it. So when people say, well, I just got a simple will and no problem, everything's just going to end up with my kids, that's not necessarily true because the will have to be presented to the court. So how do we avoid the probate process? We use something called a living trust. And the trust, the purpose for it is that it's a private document that can allow for someone to step into your shoes and continue managing things even when you're gone, right? So when do we recommend a trust? We recommend it when you have real estate in particular, right? Real property, because it's very difficult to transfer that real property to the next generation or whoever you want to leave it to without having to go through the court process. So we had a situation in California, and husband and wife, they had one property, right? They were both on title. The husband passed away. This was a second marriage, but still, both on title. Everybody in the family gets along. Everybody's good. The husband passed away. Unfortunately, they found out that on title, they were tenants in common instead of joint tenants with rights of survivorship. So what does that mean? Joint tenants with rights of survivorship means that if you pass away, then the one that survives gets everything, right? But tenants in common means they have it separate. So one of them passes away, the other one has to get title to that part. Well, they were still married at the time that he passed away. The family was all in agreement. Everybody knew this is all for mom, right? The house is going to be for mom. She's going to live the rest of her life. No problems, right? Unfortunately, because the title wasn't the way that it should have been, she had to go through probate. And the probate process in California, it's not as bad here in Connecticut, right? But in California, it's a nightmare. And so they were in probate for 1.5 years for one property, right? The court forced them to sell the property. Because they ended up selling the property, they had to pay off some debts and obligations and the mortgage and different things. They lost 60% of the value of the home. 60% of the value of what was left. This is her personal residence, right? And over 18 months. So it can be a nightmare if you don't have a proper plan. And this was in a situation where nobody thought that it was going to be an issue because everybody was in agreement. Everything's good. It's in mom and dad's, name. And unfortunately, it was still a problem. So what did we learn from this? We learned, number one, that everybody needs to have a plan. Number two, if you have real estate, the trust is the best way to avoid the court system and avoid probate. And number three, even if you have a simple situation, it's a good idea to discuss with a professional that can let you know what risks or things that you are not anticipating that you should be aware of, right? And so every estate plan, and when we sit down with our clients, you know, everything that we talk about is every estate plan needs to have three parts. Number one, it needs to have a life plan because it needs to protect you, not just when you pass away, but also while you're alive. In the case of emergencies, who's going to make decisions? In the case of, you know, liability, how are you going to protect yourself? In the case of, you know, taxes, depending on your situation, maybe there's opportunities to protect you from taxes, right? And then secondly, it's important to have what we call a transfer plan. And this is what most of us think when we think of wills and trusts. We think, well, how are things going to transfer to the next generation, right? And so the question is, are we avoiding the court system? And are we avoiding the conflicts for that transfer? And again, in most cases, the answer will be setting up a document that outlines who's going to be in charge and who's going to receive the assets and how that process is going to take place. And then finally, a family plan. And this is one of the things I think a lot of people get wrong, is that they say, well, this is a private document. I don't want anybody to know what's in it. Nobody needs to know my business, right? But then the problem is that when you pass away, nobody knows your business. Nobody knows who's going to be in charge. Nobody knows where to find the documents. Nobody knows anything, right? And the other problem is that a lot of times families are not the same. So if you go and get a form online that's, you know, the same one size fits all for everybody, it may or may not address your situation. Because sometimes we have family members that are difficult, right? Or sometimes we have family members that don't get along. Or sometimes we have family members that have very specific needs or problems, right? So let me give you an example. We had a situation where, and actually this was a client that had done an estate plan. So they had done the right thing. They had done a trust. They had put things in place. And unfortunately, they hadn't set up everything inside of their trust. So they had 3 kids. And they had a few different assets. So they have a home. They had 2 bank accounts. They had a life insurance policy. And then they had a business. And she passed away. And her husband had predeceased her, right? So she was the last one. She passed away, and everything was supposed to go equally to the 3 kids. So the kids assumed that everything was going to go equally to them, and then they go start looking at the bank accounts and looking at the plan and everything else that she had left. And as it turned out, she had left one of the kids as the beneficiary of her bank account, right? Payable on death beneficiary. And she left another one of the kids as the beneficiary of her life insurance. And then she had put the house into the trust and said that it was going to be divided equally among all the kids. And she put one of the kids as a partner on the business, the LLC that she had, which held a rental property. So now she passed away. Everything's supposed to be equal among the 3 kids, right? What actually happened? Well, one of them got the life insurance. One of them got the bank account. One of them got the business, and the other one got 1/4 of the house that was supposed to be equal among everybody, right? So what do you think happened next? They were in my office talking to me about how to make things fair, right? And so sometimes equal is not fair, and fair is not equal. Sometimes that's intentional. In this case, it was not intentional, right? So one of the things that we emphasize is making sure that if it's important for the family to know about, then transparency is best. Let them know about what the plan is. Let them know about who's going to be in charge. Who's the trustee going to be? If you're not going to choose one of the kids, well, maybe it's a friend or another family member. Let people know where to find the documents if something happens to you, right? And so because all those things help to move things along if there's a problem. And then also addressing specific people in the family and specific needs individually, right? If you have a special needs child, we need to address that in the plan. Don't assume that somebody's going to take care of somebody, because we've seen time and time again where family members don't take care of their siblings or don't take care of their loved ones simply because it's too complicated. or because it's going to affect their benefits, or because they get more money if they don't, right? And so don't assume that that's going to happen. Put it in writing and make those expectations clear. Let's see. The next thing that that we want to share is maybe some of these common mistakes that that happen, right? So one of the common mistakes is that a lot of times people don't put things in writing, and they assume that things are going to be taken care of because they told somebody in the family, right? But the problem is that a lot of times in these stories, mom told me this, and then the other sibling says, well, that's not what she told me. She told me this. And with the best intentions, now they're fighting each other in court. So here's an example. We had a situation where a lady passed away. She was a rancher, and she had, you know, multiple horses, and she raised horses and trained them and everything else. She had a grandchild that she had left one of the horses for, and basically gifted it to her, right? And so this grandchild had connected with the horse, loved the horse, but legally in writing, nothing was in place to give it to this grandchild, right? So now she passes away, and everything was supposed to go to one of the aunts, but the grandchild was the one that wanted to keep this horse. So now they're in court. How much was the horse worth? Maybe $12,000, maybe. Maybe if you were to, like, if it was the best of its class of horse, I forget what kind of horse it was, I think it was a quarter horse, but maybe $20,000. How much did they spend fighting in court over the horse? Both parties spent $70,000 fighting over the horse in court, right? And so these are things that sometimes we just assume it's automatic because, of course, this is the way it's going to go. And if you don't have it in writing, it's not automatic. It doesn't just happen by itself, right? How about not planning around benefits? Sometimes there's things that you would be able to be entitled to, but because you didn't plan ahead of time, you're unable to take advantage of those things. We'll talk more about that. How about, you know, relying on your children to decide for you because you don't want to make a decision of things? Well, that can cause problems later because they also don't want to make the decision, right? So we've had situations, by the way, one of these that was in court for 3.5 years was because there was 4 decision makers that were all supposed to make a decision together. They couldn't make a decision together. Half the time it was because they didn't want to talk about it, right? And because they can't make a decision, they can't move forward. If they could have just gotten around a table, they could have made a decision. They wouldn't have had to wait for 3 years. But because they couldn't talk to each other and open up and that sort of thing, it took 3.5 years before they can move things forward. So don't rely on them to make the decisions. Leave it in writing and let them know what your decision was, right? Doing the same thing that you had planned out 20 years ago, because what? Our situations change. Right now, I have individuals named to be the guardian for my kids, right? But my kids are all little. Is that going to change in 20 years? Of course it will, right? Because they're going to go to college and they're going to grow up and they're going to have different. And so your plan is not a one-time thing that you do and leave it on a shelf and forget about it forever. It's a living document. That's why it's called a living trust, is because it's a living document that you should be adjusting as your life progresses and changes. And when should you address it? Every 2 to 5 years, right? Look at the plan. But really, you should address it every time that you have a major life change. So if you move states, review your plan. If you have a new child, review your plan. If somebody passes away, review the plan, right? And update it accordingly. How about not naming a responsible person to assist with things? And especially some of us get to the point where we don't have anybody that's living that we trust to make decisions on our behalf. And so we just say, well, I'm not going to put anybody down because I just don't trust that they'll be able to do it. And then what happens when the emergency comes? Nobody is authorized to make decisions, right? And it becomes a nightmare. We had one of these situations in Florida where the lady was, she was 84 years old. She had some distant relatives, but she didn't really have any immediate family. And she had done quite well for herself. She you know, one of her husbands had passed away, left her some stuff, and she had done some real estate investing. She had, I think, 15 properties and It was a multi-million-dollar estate. But she got really sick and she didn't have anybody authorized to be able to make decisions for her. And she was unconscious in the hospital and nobody could make decisions. And so what ended up happening was that one of her neighbors got involved, and then she ended up just signing authority over to them to make decisions because she was, conscious for a couple days and then she went unconscious again. And the next thing you know, for some reason, nobody knows why this happened, right? Because I found out after the fact, but nobody knows how this happened. But apparently her will and everything had been changed to leave everything to that neighbor. And that wasn't necessarily her intention. And why did that happen? Because nobody was a responsible party when the emergency came up, right? And so it became very difficult to unwind later. Yeah. It can be. So, everything in the law, the answer is it depends. That's always the answer, right? But in that situation, yes, they have fiduciary responsibilities. They have to comply with those responsibilities. If it was reasonable for them to pass it on to the attorney every single time, then it might have been, acceptable and reasonable. If it wasn't reasonable for them to do that, which is something that a court would have to decide, then they could be responsible for that. Well, and I got to tell you guys, and this is, not to put my profession down, but there are a lot of attorneys out there where the strategy is to set up a will rather than a trust, right? They'll actually tell you to do that because they plan on you coming back for the probate, and then they can bill for all the time that they spend on the probate, right? And sometimes the strategy is for them to say, okay, well, just let us handle all of it, but then they're going to be billing for all of that, right? Even if it was something that you could do yourself. And so it's important and valuable for you to know enough to make a good decision for your situation, but also to be aware that, when a law office tells you something, it may or may not be in your best interest. It may or may not be the best legal answer, and it may or may not be the most financial, the most reasonable financial answer, right? So that's the last one here, right? Choosing the wrong professionals, that can cause a big problem in the estate. And then the last piece that we'll talk here about the estate planning, and then maybe we'll open it up if anybody has any questions before we move on, is how do you leave a legacy? Because a lot of times people say, they tell me this all the time. They say, well, you know what? My kids don't need anything. They don't need the money. They don't need the properties. I'm just going to spend my last dollar when I die. But how many of us actually do that? Because if we're actually going to do that, then we need to spend the money, right? And then they make decisions to accumulate and to save and to keep more, and to, sometimes they even affect their lifestyle because they're scrimping and saving to leave something for who? If you don't want to leave it for anyone, then why would you do that, right? And if you do want to leave it for somebody, like for example, if you want to leave a large legacy of wealth to the family, the easiest way to do that is get the biggest life insurance that you possibly could. You'll leave a lot of money to them, right? But leaving money by itself might not be enough because money goes through your fingers, right? If it's like water, if it's not directed properly, it can just disappear very quickly. So leaving a legacy is not just about leaving the assets to the right people. It's also about leaving your values, leaving your life stories, and leaving everything as part of, the context of why you want to leave it to them. So for example, when you address your family needs in your estate plan in writing, right, with very specific instructions, those instructions have to be followed. but sometimes the family will still resent you for those instructions, right? Because maybe they want all the money up front or whatever. But if you want to make sure that they understand why you're leaving it, then you leave expressions of your values. You leave, some of those reasons of why you want them to do certain things. And even then, they might not agree with your values, right? Because, sometimes the kids don't have the same mentality as the parents, right? So you leave your life stories and your experiences as the context for where those values came from. And even if they don't agree with it, at least they'll know where it came from, right? And so we've helped families set up plans that will continue from generation to generation to generation for 1,000 years or more with this type of structure where we say, well, look, these are the rules. Here's what you have to follow. Here's how it's going to be divided. And here's why. This is important to us. This is important to, the family values and everything. And this is, where it came from for us, so that at a minimum, they have the context of understanding where it's coming from, right? And that's how you leave a legacy that can continue. So if you guys have heard of like the Rockefellers and the Vanderbilts, you guys have heard this story? This is becoming very popular online, right? The Rockefellers kept the wealth together, and they set up a structure that could continue from generation to generation to generation. It's still one of the most wealthy families in the United States. The Vanderbilts set it up basically for it to be divided equally among the kids. Some of the kids do well, some of the kids don't do well with it. And within 2 generations, all the wealth is gone. Why? Taxes, probates, fighting between family members, poor decisions, predatory companies, all kinds of different things that we have to deal with, right? It's very easy and common for our wealth to disappear if you don't have a proper plan. So, the difference between proper planning ahead of time and just letting kind of things fall out after the fact. So any questions on that before we go on the estate planning piece? Yeah. So to choose a care plan or to choose someone to make decisions for their healthcare? Or a power of attorney? Yeah. So the thing is that private institutions are worried about liability, right? And if you go to the hospital and there's an issue, they're going to stay very close to their legal guidelines as an institution, because your comfort and your family's, priorities don't matter to the institution. They're going to make sure that they're protecting themselves, right? And so if you don't have something in writing authorizing the decision maker, then that falls upon the institution to make the decision as to whether they're going to let you make a decision on behalf of that person or not. So in the state of Connecticut, doing a healthcare power of attorney is actually very simple. It's a very simple process. But if you don't have that, you're leaving it up to the medical institution, the hospital. They're going to decide whether they're going to allow family members to make a decision or not. And quite frankly, I don't live out here, so I don't know how generous the healthcare systems out here are with that. But if you don't want to leave it up to chance, you should put it in writing. Uh-huh. Well, the reason it's not a big issue most of the time is because most of the time people are conscious and they can speak and they can say what they want, right? And so when you go into a hospital, one of the first things that they offer you is a healthcare directive for you to be able to say who can make decisions on your behalf. That's why it's usually not that big of an issue. But there are circumstances where they find you unconscious and they bring you into the hospital, and because you can't speak for yourself, they're going to say, well, who can? And unless there's a legal authority to do that, then it's up to the institution. Yeah. Yes, you can leave directives and force them to act in certain ways, but um, you can also leave decisions up to other individuals or to beneficiaries or depending. So you have, as the maker of the trust, you have the ability to decide. Yeah, but there are ways to do that. Yeah. Mhm. So there are two types of powers of attorney, and this is actually getting into the next part. But you want to have a financial and a medical power of attorney, right? Because the financial power of attorney usually doesn't cover any medical decisions, and the medical one usually doesn't cover any financial, right? So that's generally two separate ones. The healthcare side of that can have multiple different names. It can be a healthcare proxy, it can be a healthcare directive, it can be an advanced directive. There's lots of different names for it. But at the end of the day, what you're doing is you're authorizing someone to make medical decisions on your behalf. Some of those forms, those documents, also authorize other things. Like, for example, do you want to be an organ donor or not? If you find yourself on life support, do you want to be kept alive or not? If you don't authorize those specific things in your healthcare directive or in your healthcare proxy, then there are other forms that you can do that with, right? So there's like a living will. A lot of times people say, well, I have a living will, so that means all my property gets transferred to my kids. No, it doesn't. A living will is a healthcare document. Living will is for you to say if you want to be kept alive on life support or not, right? That's the purpose for the living will. Even though it sounds like a will, it's actually a healthcare document, right? Um, so yeah, it depends on specifically what the form says or what the document says. Um, you need then a healthcare proxy. So you want a medical and a financial. Yeah. Sure. Yeah. So she was sharing that, that she just went through this process and that she was able to get documents for her children and also for her mom. So you need to have documents for the financial side and you need to have documents for the medical side or the healthcare side. And by the way, if you have older children that are going to college and you're doing these kind of forms, every college also has their own form. And so it's important to read to see what it covers because a lot of those forms cover very little and they're very specific to, and so it might make sense to actually have something more comprehensive done instead of just using the university's form because that comes up also. So the most abused financial instrument is the power of attorney. And so, and we'll talk about this right now, but one of the things that's very important is in your power of attorney, you want it to be a general durable power of attorney And most of the time, if you're in good health, you want it to be a springing power of attorney. So what do all those words mean? It means that you want a power of attorney that continues even after you become incapacitated. That means it's durable. If it's not durable, then it actually ends as soon as you can't speak for yourself. The power of attorney stops. It doesn't really do any good, right? So most of the time you don't want that. In certain business decisions and other things, maybe you do, but most of the time you want it to be durable, where it will continue even after you're incapacitated, right? The second part is generally you want it to be springing, which means that you don't want it to be active all the time. You only want it to become active when you need it to be. And most of the time that means that you're incapacitated, right? So if you become incapacitated, then it would spring into effect. And that's what's called a springing durable power of attorney, right? And you also want it to be general. What does that mean? It means it covers almost everything you would need it for. So the problem of just having a power of attorney out there is that that person has a lot of authority. They can act as if they're you. So yeah, they can write checks, they can do everything. They can make all decisions. And banks are notoriously bad for monitoring what they could do and what they could not do. And so people overreach, right? So you want to put somebody that you can trust into that role. If there's a need to limit their powers, you want to make sure that that's specifically in the document saying that the powers are limited. But most of the time you want it to include everything, because if it's not specifically on there, again, because of liability, the bank institutions or the companies are not going to follow it. They're not going to accept it, right? So that's an important thing. We're gonna come back to questions at the end. We'll open it up for questions again, but let's keep going here. So what are the biggest drains on your estate? If you don't have a proper plan, these are the three biggest things that can affect the assets that you spend your entire life building, right? Number one, probate fees and court costs. How do you avoid that? What we just talked about. Have a proper plan. Make sure that things transfer outside of probate. The two best ways to do that are beneficiary designations or having a living trust, right? Which can avoid probate. The second is taxes. And a lot of times people are very afraid of taxes because they say, well, I don't want the government to take half of everything when I pass away. Right now, the estate tax exemption limit is very high. It's like $13 million per person. If you're married, that's double. So $26 million, right? So most of us don't need to worry about that. That's a lifetime exemption. So even if you're making gifts to people during your lifetime, if you don't go over that amount, you're not going to have to worry about estate taxes, right? In most cases, there are exceptions, right? For non-citizens and, non-resident aliens, that sort of thing. But in most cases, you're not going to have to worry about estate taxes. But what taxes would your kids need to worry about or your beneficiaries worry about? There's only two types of taxes that generally come up, right? Because when you inherit property, you get something called a step up in basis over that property. That means that the fair market value of the property at the time of its transfer to the next generation, right? Whoever you leave as your beneficiary, your heir, they're gonna not have any capital gains if they sell that property immediately. So whatever the fair market value is, that's their new basis. They won't have any tax if they sell it, right? So what taxes will they have? Well, if you have a 401k plan or an IRA or any kind of qualified plan, that is subject to tax because it's never been taxed before. So it will be taxed for the first time when it's received. And now, unfortunately, they've changed the rules where that has to actually be pulled out completely within 5 years. Within 5 years, yeah. So there used to be that you could stretch it out, right? You can pull it out over 5 years. The rule is you can realize it over 10 years. So for tax purposes, you can pay the tax over 10 years, but it still has to be pulled out within 5 years. So it used to be that you could do stretch IRAs, which would last the entire lifetime of your beneficiary, right? And then they pull out a little at a time. And this all plays into what we're going to talk about in a little bit. We'll call required minimum distributions, right? But it used to be that you could stretch it out for an entire lifetime. Nowadays, at most, they're going to realize the tax over 10 years, right? A Roth IRA is post-tax, so it's not going to have tax when you pull it out. Yeah. And then the third biggest strain on our estates is actually long-term care costs. Because how expensive is it to go into a long-term care facility and have care? And by the way, for males, the average is 1.5 years of care, right? For females, the average is about 3.5 years. So if you think about, the cost of long-term care, which national average is close to $70,000 a year, above and beyond your regular cost of living, right? 120 here. You guys are beating the average. May or may not be a good thing, but that can add up. That can add up a lot, right? And so that's the biggest drain on our estates. And again, how do you get around that? So we've talked a lot about this, the importance of designating someone to make decisions on your behalf, right? It's not automatic that you can make decisions for somebody else if they're an adult, right? Having general durable power of attorney is what we talked about. That helps avoid guardianships and conservatorships. It's the court process for somebody to make decisions when there's nothing in place. It can be expensive. It can be it's a public process. It's very time consuming. And so avoiding all of that process is very easy by doing powers of attorney. And make sure that you appoint someone for financial and medical, right? So for paying for care, if you need, and again, 72% of us are going to need it, you have 3 options. You can either pay with your own funds, but how many of us have saved up enough to be able to pay for care on our own, right? You can have insurance pay for it, and how many of us have put that in place already to make sure that we're covering long-term care needs, right? Or you can have the government pay for it. Each of these has a catch, right? If you pay with your own funds, well, that means that it's coming out of pocket, and it means it could be more, more expensive, and it means that it's going to be a drain on all the other assets. But there are ways to earmark your funds to cover more when it comes to care than what those funds would normally buy. So you can actually put your funds into an investment that would give you 2 or 3 times the value if you need it for long-term care. There are solutions like that, right? In the past, long-term care insurance was what we called use it or lose it, right? If you have long-term care insurance in place and you pay for it for years, if you never need it, then it's lost and you can't use it for anything. That's not how it is nowadays. Nowadays, there's a lot of different options. In fact, the most economical options sometimes is putting life insurance in place that has long-term care included. So if you ever need long-term care, your life insurance actually doubles as long-term care coverage. Sure. Yeah, so there are 2 types of long-term care plans. And depending on the insurance you have in place and whatnot, they're going to ask who's the person that's actually going to benefit from the policy that's put in place. That person's called the insured, right? And the insured may or may not be the same as the beneficiary. But what happens is that if the insured has a long-term care need, which is defined by 3 of the 5 activities of daily living that they can't do on their own, right? Then that means that it triggers the fact that they need long-term care. So if you can't get in and out of bed by yourself, if you can't go to the restroom by yourself, if you can't feed yourself, if you can't, if you can't, well, I think, did I say that? Yeah, so it's transfer, continence, eating. No, it's, So essentially being able to get in and out of bed, being able to, mobility is another one, right? Being able to get around by yourself, being able to eat, being able to go to the restroom, or being able to bathe yourself. Those are the activities of daily living, right? If you have 3 or more of those that you can't do by yourself, then you're considered to need long-term care, right? And so then a policy that covers that would pay out and they're going to pay out to the beneficiary that you've designated. Most of the time on a long-term care policy, it's going to be the same person as the insured. But sometimes you'll have somebody else listed that would receive that money, and the expectation is, depending on the policy, it's either an indemnity policy, meaning that they get to use it for, whatever they want. Essentially, they're responsible for the bill, and then they get the money, right? And it replaces the responsibility of what they have to pay, right? Or it's going to be a reimbursement, which means that they actually have to pay for it first, and then they'll provide the money after that care is paid for. So sometimes there's a problem because there's a disconnect between the beneficiary that's receiving the funds and the person responsible for paying for the care, and the person receiving the funds doesn't pay for the care, and then that creates a problem, right? So it's important to make sure that whoever's going to be responsible for the decisions, you should match that person, right? The medical decisions, because it might not be the same as the financial person, but for long-term care purposes, you probably want that to be the same person. More questions on that, or? So, beneficiary designations are really useful because it's all a matter of contract law. So it's the same thing with like a trust. A trust is a contract, right? That's how it gets around the need for probate. And so when you have a beneficiary designation, it will go directly to that beneficiary without having to go through probate. If you have a life insurance with the beneficiary designated, it's going to go to that person directly, right? It doesn't have to go through probate. However, there's no strings attached. There's no instructions to that. So if you want instructions on that, for example, if you're leaving it to a 5-year-old, we had this happen where, dad had put the child as his beneficiary instead of the spouse. He passes away, the child's 5 years old, he can't receive it because he's not old enough. Because he can't receive it, what had to happen? Mom has to go and become the guardian, receive it through probate on his behalf, and report to the court every year until he turns 18. And at age 18, whatever's left, if there is anything, goes straight to him, right? Might not have been what dad wanted, but that's how he left things, right? So beneficiary designation, generally, you want to put whoever you want to receive that asset, you put them on there. If you have a trust, you'll probably put the trust, and then the trust will have the instructions on what's supposed to happen with it. Yeah. Good. What are your options? Yeah, so these are the 3 options. And if we can't get insurance in place, right, for whatever reason, then we can see if we can designate funds, earmark funds specifically for that, right? So we had a situation where we sat down with somebody and they had about, 200,000 in savings that they didn't need for retirement, right? Because he had a pension and he had, Social Security, and we'll get into that. So he had enough to be able to get by. But I said, look, the biggest risk to your estate is long-term care costs. So let's earmark 100,000 of this just in case you need it for long-term care. Where we put it would actually give him $300,000 worth of value if he needed to pay for self-care, right? But the third option is you can have the government pay. The problem is that the government only pays if you have less than $5,000 of value to your name, right? So the program is called Medicaid, and you get on Medicaid if you can prove that you've basically expended all of your other resources. And if we want to plan for Medicaid, we can, so we can move things out of your name to be able to qualify for that. And there's strategies using a Medicaid trust to do that. But we have to put it in place 5 years before you apply, because there's a 5-year look back period on that. Yeah. Yeah, talk to us later. Yeah. Yeah, there are products that work that way. Yeah.
If money to heirs, whatever, and then 3 years later, you find you are going to need to have to go into Facility. Now, facility says, oh, you get 20,000 to this person. Does that person have to put the 20,000 to get first?
So if you apply for Medicaid and they find out that you had given money away, then that's exactly what's going to happen is they're going to say, well, you either have to pull it back, right? They claw it back into your assets so that they can collect from it and be repaid, or they're going to say, well, because you had a disqualifying transfer, we're going to kick you off of the program. The problem with getting kicked off of the program is that then when you reapply to the program, it's a nightmare to get back on. Title 19. So let's talk more about that after. But yeah, so the Medicaid program is a safeguard, right? It's intended to be the last resort. But there are ways to plan around it. And we've had some people come to us to plan around it when they have, we had somebody come to us, not going to name any names or anything, but they came in and they're multimillionaires and they wanted to plan for Medicaid. That's not really the intention for the program, right? The intention is for somebody who has maybe a home, some savings, but it's not going to be enough to cover for long-term care to be able to plan around it and be able to qualify. And there are other programs also that can help. So if you're a veteran or a spouse of a veteran, there are benefits available through the VA that are called aid and attendance benefits. So we can plan around those. There are other programs that might also qualify. That's a good question. That's a good question. And it depends. Every facility is different because some facilities have Medicaid beds that are set aside for those that are on Medicaid, right? And most of the time it's the same accommodations as the rest of the facility. But then there are some facilities that are only for Medicaid patients and some facilities that will not take Medicaid patients, right? And so the type of care that you would want for yourself may or may not be what Medicaid would provide. Yeah, it depends. There can be, yeah, depending on the product. Yeah. And financial assets. There's some exempt assets that don't get counted. But then even those assets could be collected from after you pass away, like your personal residence, for example. That does count, yeah. So a lot of times the time to plan for this sort of thing with a Medicaid trust would be if you have like a rental property, put it into a Medicaid trust 5 years before you need to qualify, right? Because then we get it out of the name and we preserve it for the family. Your main home will not disqualify you. It may still be subject to recollection after you pass away, depending, right? And I should have brushed up on what Connecticut says about that, but I haven't yet. So, but we could look it up together if you have a question about that after. You are limited to the facilities that accept the Medicaid. Yeah. Yeah. And remember that Medicaid is not the same as Medicare. They're different programs. They're for different purposes. Medicare is for your ongoing healthcare needs and medications and all that. And Medicaid is a different program, but that's the one that covers long-term care needs, right? Yeah, back. So regarding assisted care, it's very expensive. So if you have Medicare or if you have health insurance coverage, generally speaking, they will cover up to 90 days of assisted care, right? Or around the clock care. After those 90 days, then it's either Medicaid or self-pay or a long-term care type of insurance. Depending on the terms of your coverage, and depending on, again, how you're planning on paying for the assisted care. Yeah. Does anything last after that? Yeah, let's talk after, because I'm having a little bit of hard time hearing you, and it sounds like it's maybe a personal situation that we can discuss. Perfect. All right. So because of everything that we've talked about, it's important to make sure that you're planning for your needs, right? For making sure that you have enough coming in, that you can pay for care in the future, that you can pay for, your personal expenses and everything. And that comes into what we call retirement planning. So where are your retirement funds going to be coming from? One source is Social Security. And where does Social Security come from? Comes from us. You paid for it, right? You paid for it while you were working during your working years, you pay into it. And then when you retire, you get it back, right? And so they have a program that's a sliding scale that says when you're this age, you get to start receiving this much. And when you're this age, you get to start receiving this much, right? And they reserve the right to say that if there's no money, then you get nothing, right? That's the caveat. Hopefully it will last for a while still. But there's a lot of things that sometimes are confusing about Social Security benefits. And so, what is your full retirement age? Does it make sense to wait or to take it as soon as you're eligible? What's going to count in terms of your, what you've paid into it? And generally speaking, whoever the breadwinner was that was making more in the household, the credits that they accumulated during their working life, that's what you're going to be able to base it off of, unless they're still alive. Then you will go off of your own work history. And when they pass away, then you get to go off of their work history, right? And so the idea is that Social Security keeps track of all this stuff. And there's a calculator, it's very easy to use online to be able to find out what your estimated amount is going to be. Then the question is, should you take it earlier or should you take it later? Well, that's going to depend on your situation. But a lot of times it makes sense to take it earlier, even though you're getting less, because you get to receive it longer, right? And so the amount of money that you get in the end is actually going to end up being more than if you wait to take it. So that's a conversation for a financial professional where you can sit down and say, okay, what are my expectations for retirement? Where is the money coming from? Does it make sense to wait or to take the Social Security now? Maybe it makes sense for one in the household, right, his husband or wife, to take the Social Security earlier and then later take the other one, right? Because there's more credit on one of them or there's less credit on the other, right? And then the government also requires you to start taking it after a certain time. If you have, money saved up in 401ks, IRAs, that sort of thing, then they require you to start pulling from that because they want the tax on it, right? So somebody had the question earlier about taxation of your Social Security benefits. If you're under $32,000 a year in income as a married couple, then you don't have to worry about that, right? But what happens with Social Security benefits is that it in and of itself is not generally taxed, but it's counted as taxable income. So your other income becomes taxed. Does that make sense? So, we have a graduated tax rate. Your first dollars are generally exempt up to a certain limit. And then after you reach a certain threshold, then the tax rates start, right? And your Social Security will count as part of that income. And so if it pushes your other income to be taxable, then that's what ends up happening. And now more than ever, it's going to push your income to be taxable, right? So use the calculator online. That's a good rule of thumb. And then we already covered this, but again, remember that, the Social Security benefits are different from the Medicaid program. They're different from the Medicare program. They're different from all those type of benefits. So you want to talk to a specialist that can help you to make decisions in regards to each one of those. And where will your income or your retirement come from, right? Maybe part of it is Social Security. Part of it might be pensions or annuities that you've set up, right, which pay you every year until you pass away. Part of it might be, your 401k savings or employer-sponsored plans. Part of it might be your personal savings that you've put away for the future. And part of it might be, assets that you own that currently are, held as rentals or held as, as an asset that you would need to liquidate for that, right? So the question becomes, do you know what you're going to need for retirement, how much you're going to need, and where the sources of those funds are going to come from? And a lot of times, people don't realize that they are not in a situation that's really securing their financial future for retirement, because we're used to what we were doing 20 years ago, and maybe things have changed a little bit on a personal level of what you need. So for example, there are 3 ways that our money can grow, and there are 3 ways that our money can be taxed. And this depends determines where we're putting our savings for the future. So we can either have our money growing at a fixed rate, which usually isn't very much, maybe in a CD, a money market, maybe it's, in the bank account, but it's secure, right? And liquid a lot of times. Or we can have it on the other side where it's going up and down with the market. And maybe we have a money manager, or maybe it's with Morgan Stanley or Fidelity or whoever. But depending on how they're managing it, it's going to go up with the market, and it's going to go down with the market. And I can't tell you how many times we sit down with seniors. We just did this the other day, where we sat down with somebody who had all of their life savings in stocks. No problem with that, right? And they say that they're diversified. And I said, well, okay, well, let's see how diversified you are. So we look at their portfolio. They have 80 different stocks. All of their returns were coming from 2. And mostly from 1. So most of their accounts were performing at less than 1%. One of their accounts was performing at 6%, and the other account was performing at 15%. And on average, across the board, they showed an 11% return. They thought that was good. If that one company does bad, or all of a sudden tanks, or that one company happened to be Apple, which is going through a major change of leadership, if that all of a sudden goes down, you don't have the time to wait for it to come back, right? So they were actually in a very bad position in terms of diversification. So that's one of the things to review. It's not enough to say, oh, well, what's my average? No, let's have somebody dig into it and figure out what's actually going on and whether it even makes sense for you to have it in a variable situation, right? And then when it comes to how the money is taxed, you get to choose. You can put it into like a bank account or something, in general, it's going to be taxed every single year as the money accumulates. You get a return or a statement saying how much you made so that you can pay taxes on it. Or you can have it deferred, where in a 401k or an IRA, you're not paying the tax up front, but when are you going to pay it? At the end when you pull it out, right? So because it still needs to be taxed. Or if you have a Roth account or, certain insurance type of accumulation strategies, there are also tax-free municipal bonds, those sort of things. Then you pay the tax when you earn the money and you let it grow tax-free. You never have to pay the tax again, right? And why is this important? Because when you get to retirement, the source of where you're drawing income from is going to determine the taxes that you end up paying on that income, right? So what we recommend is what's called tax diversification. Have some in this bucket for liquidity purposes, have some in this bucket to avoid tax now because you might be in a higher tax rate, and have some in this bucket to avoid tax later so that it doesn't put you in a higher tax bracket when you're pulling for retirement. And the reason for this is a different philosophy. A lot of times people meet with their financial professional and everything's about returns and fees, and does it make sense for me to be here or here because we're going to get you better returns. But at the end of the day, returns only matter if you're in the first phase of your financial life, which is the accumulation phase. of building up your assets, right? At some point, you're going to get into what we call the preservation stage, where the priority is saving what you have and maybe getting some returns on top of that. But priority is keeping what you got, right? And then the third phase is what we call distribution. That's when you start pulling from the account and paying for your lifestyle and your needs. So the person that specializes in this usually doesn't specialize in this. That makes sense? And so a lot of times people say, well, yeah, I have a great guy. I've been using him for 20 years. He did amazing for me in building up my wealth, but now I'm pulling out from the account and maybe there's other options. Maybe there's ways to be able to stretch those funds so that they will accomplish more. Or maybe there's ways for you to keep more of it when you pass, because the last stage is the transfer stage, where you transfer it to whoever you want to leave it to, right? And then that starts all up again. But in that transfer phase, if that's a priority, there are also options to maximize the transfer. So again, depending on which stage you're in, make sure you're working with a professional that specializes in that area. And then finally, as we talk about right sizing, the idea is when you get to retirement, depending on the realities of the income and retirement funds and everything available to you, the question is, what is your retirement shortfall? Do you have a retirement shortfall? The difference between today's lifestyle that you're used to living and the amount that you will have in retirement, do you have enough to provide the same lifestyle? And if you don't, where is that shortfall going to come from? Will you keep working? Will you have assets that you can liquidate to get that value from? We just met with somebody recently who, she has a shortfall and she's paying on a pretty big mortgage still. She's single. She doesn't have any kids. She doesn't really have any heirs or anybody that she wants to leave things to. And she's worried about having enough in retirement. Well, one of the things we recommended for her was called a home equity conversion mortgage. In the past, they called them reverse mortgages, right? Why would we recommend that to somebody? Well, in her case, she doesn't have anybody to leave the home to. So there's no need to preserve the value. And she can access tax-free money from the home, from her equity, and get rid of her monthly payment. So we got rid of a $1,200 a month payment for her. And now she has access to a line of credit through her home, so if she ever needs it, right, to make up that retirement shortfall of $300,000. And it puts her in a much stronger position for the future, right? So a lot of times we create these rules and guidelines for ourselves that may or may not make sense. So again, question, where is the shortfall going to be made up from? Do you have the living situation that you want to maintain that same cost of living by living where you're currently living? Or do you need to maybe move somewhere where it's going to make more sense, right? Because you have two options. So you can either make more, right? More from your investments or from whatever, either bring in more or spend less. Those are the only two options. They're the two levers, right? And so on the living, situation, would you need less space? Because maybe you don't need to live where you're currently living. Maybe you need a smaller space. Or do you need more space? Because maybe you need to have family move in with you, right? Or maybe you have to have, accessibility requirements to be able to continue living in your home. Like, those are things to think about, right? Do you need to pay less on your mortgage? Because you might not be able to keep up with it if you retire and the sources of income are not enough. Or do you need to access equity in the home, right? And meet with a mortgage professional that could talk about options for that. And there are certain options available only to seniors. I have a client of mine that did, for example, a reverse mortgage we talked about earlier. He did a reverse mortgage and I asked him why, because his house was a $3 million property. Why would you do that? And he goes, because where else am I going to get access to tax-free money at a line of credit that grows every single year and I have no payment on it? And I can, leave it to my kids if I want to, or I can draw on it whenever I want. I don't have to go ask for another loan from the bank ever for the rest of my life. Like, okay, well, I guess that makes sense, right? So it just depends on your situation. And again, are you gonna, be in a situation where you need full-time care, where you actually need to go to a facility where somebody's taking care of you? Or is it something that you can receive care in home? And by the way, there are even agreements where you can pay your own family to take care of you. That are Medicaid compliant, right? We call them caregiver agreements, right? Where they can take care of you at home. So those are just some of the options. So in the end, again, what if you can meet with someone that would structure what you need so that you never run out? They can share information with you to help you avoid taxes, to avoid draining your assets, to avoid probate, avoid other conflicts, to prepare you for important decisions, and to preserve value for your family, for your loved ones, and that sort of thing. And the answer is meet with a professional that can specialize and give you the right guidance for your situation, right? And if you would like some of that guidance, we'll be here at the back. We're going to be available to answer questions. And we will also open it up for questions if we have any. I don't even know what time we have, actually.
Don't everybody leave, in addition to saying thank you. I even took a lot of notes. I do want to say, this is a good segue, in February, notice how I did that? We are having a woman from Meadow Ridge come and speak with us about the continuum of care, okay? So, and you'll be getting a lot of information about that, but right now, if we have any questions for you, you can still do your magic, okay? And
All right.
thank you in advance, but don't go, okay?
Let's try to use this microphone for the questions.
Hi, thank you for the planning information. My question is, how do we plan, what should we plan for the cost of doing all of that? In terms of, financial advice and legal advice, what's a rough estimation?
So that's a loaded question because it really depends on who you end up working with. Most of the time, the first meeting, especially if you're planning, for retirement and, senior sort of issues, most of the time, the first meeting shouldn't cost you anything because a consultation with a professional is their opportunity to let you know why you should trust them and why they're going to do a good job for you. And most of the time, they're not going to charge for that, right? But sometimes when you go in and you do a meeting, we want all the answers right at once because that's how our world is today, right? So for example, I sat down with a client and they were talking about planning for Medicaid. And we said, well, yeah, the best option would be to be able to do a Medicaid trust, and we can sit down and have a session where we'd actually plan down the spend down of the assets to preserve the most value for the family. And they said, well, what exactly would we do? And my answer was, well, actually, that's what I charge for. So that's when it starts, right? But the cost for the planning is going to be determined by who you work with. So most attorneys are going to be somewhere between, $200 to $400 an hour if it's hourly, for this type of, work. If it's not hourly, it's going to be flat fee. And that's how we do all of our billing, is just on a flat fee basis, right? So a simple trust plan could be as low as, $800 to $4,000, right? If it's more complex, Medicaid planning, complex tax planning, irrevocable trust, those sort of things are generally going to be in the, 4 to 10,000 range. Yeah.
Hi, going back to helping to avoid probate. I understand that if you name a beneficiary, whether it be a checking account, your life insurance, any, we'll say, money asset, investments, you avoid probate, that all you need to do then is they provide a copy of the death certificate, and it is within a short term then that they receive whatever it is. So the best advice is first get as many beneficiaries listed on all accounts that you have,
It depends.
such as,
Because, so there's two scenarios where that can cause pitfalls, right? If you have a trust, which not everybody needs a trust, but if you have a trust, it's best to have the trust be the first beneficiary so everything flows through the rules of the trust. You avoid the problem that we talked about earlier, right? But what happens is that there's no legal imposition of rules or anything on your beneficiary. So for example, we've had situations where you name one of the kids as the beneficiary, and the company won't actually let you name 4 beneficiaries because for whatever reason they only allow for 1. And then you're like, well, they'll share. Mm-mm. Right? Don't just trust that they're going to share, because yeah, they'll get the death certificate, they'll send it in, they'll get the money, and then their conscience will determine whether they share or not, right? The second situation is with minors. If you list a minor as a beneficiary, they will not be able to receive the funds. They'll have to go through probate anyway. So it's better to have that run through an instrument like a trust if you were to have that situation. But otherwise, yes, if you name a beneficiary on an account, it's going to go straight to that beneficiary. It doesn't have to go through probate. And so a beneficiary designation is the best option for all of those type of accounts. And if you don't have real estate and you don't need a trust otherwise, right, then you could probably take care of everything with beneficiary designations on your accounts. Yeah. 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 So revocable trusts are trusts that can be changed, right? And you can get rid of it. You have essentially full control because you are the person that created it, but you're also allowed to serve as the trustee if you want to, right? And in essence, you're the lifetime beneficiary too until you pass away. Your revocable trust is an extension of your property. So really its purpose is to avoid probate and avoid some of those other issues, right? Provide guidance and direction. But an irrevocable trust, you have to give up some level of control in order to get certain protections. That might be for taxes, it might be for benefits, it might be for other reasons, but you have to give up some level of control to get that. So usually you can't be your own trustee, for example, in an irrevocable trust. It just depends on what you're trying to use it for.
There are many questions on the Q&A in the webinar. Do you have time to address those?
Yeah, I was hoping somebody would be able to find them on there.
Okay, Anthony's just going to make that happen.
Okay, so we cannot see the presenter. I'm sorry about that.
Go down to the bottom.
What's the instrument called that you can put funds? What is the instrument called where you can put funds for long-term care? So there are different instruments, right? There are instruments where you can put your own funds to be able to use for long-term care. They can be annuity type products. They can be other investment type products. There's different types of insurances that can cover long-term care, right? Whether it's life insurance or whether it's long-term care insurance or even certain, health insurance has riders that you can get for that. Okay. I'm over 65. I want to start taking disbursement from my IRA. Is there a minimum amount that I must take if I start before age 73? So there used to be a requirement for required minimum distributions that was, a lower age, and now it's been heightened. So basically the age now is 73. If you're not 73, you don't really have a required minimum distribution. You don't have to pull out a certain amount. Can you pull out? Yes, as soon as you are 59 and a half. There's no more penalties after 59 and a half. All right. I don't see any other ones on here, but maybe in the chat. All right. Any other questions? Yeah. So generally speaking, one trust would cover the household, right? So the husband and wife would do a joint trust, but there are sometimes advantages to husband having a trust and wife having a trust to keep assets separate. Sometimes we have situations that are like a second marriage or that sort of thing where we want to keep assets separate, or sometimes for protection from creditors, we keep assets separate like that. But generally speaking, yeah, one trust would be enough, and you have it as a joint trust, and we put all the assets in there. Yeah.
Everything goes to beneficiary, then the only thing you would need to trust for would be then the house. I mean, if all your assets are going to beneficiaries, then would be the only dangling participle would be your house?
The house is the biggest reason why someone would want to trust. Yeah.
Could you have a revocable trust for your house?
That's generally what people do. Yeah.
Oh, okay.
But if you have a trust, then we usually will use the trust for the beneficiary designations also. Because once you have it, then all the rules are baked into it.
But, and that can be revocable. Yeah,
Mhm.
and my other last question is, if you don't have a proper person to be your executor or executrix, then what the heck do you do?
So there are three options, right? You can pick someone that you know, that you trust, that you can put into a role as an executor or as a trustee. And that's usually what most people do. If you don't have someone that can fill that role for you, then there are professional fiduciaries that you can employ to fill that role, right? So there's trust companies, there's professionals specifically that run, trustee services or fiduciary services. Or if you don't want to go the professional route, right, then the third option is, again, working with, because it doesn't have to be a family member, it could be anybody, right? And so entering into an agreement with someone where terms are very clearly defined on what their role would be and what their compensation would be and everything else.
When you have an executor named, they're theoretically entitled to get a certain percentage as a fee, correct?
An executor is only in probate. So yes, because when you end up in court in probate, then there are statutory fees that they might be entitled to, or according to, their representation in the process, they're going to be entitled to payment.
And they would collect their fee after it is settled, after probate. They do not take it in advance, do they? And is it on the general overall wealth of the property even before taxes or other things are paid? When do they get that
So
fee?
in the probate process, what happens is that first somebody gets appointed, right? So if you have the initial petition, and somebody actually gets appointed as the executor or the personal representative. That person is going to have responsibilities that they have to fulfill. And they also, one of those responsibilities is to make an accounting to the court to say, here's what there is, and here's how it will be spent, right? And so they were going to account for their time and for their expenses, and the court approves the distribution of those funds. So sometimes the court will approve it before the final distribution, but most of the time it's along with the final distribution. Well, it's part of the probate process with the court.
Very much.
Yeah.
Hi, can you leave a house to a beneficiary?
In some states, yes. In some states, there's something called a transfer on death deed, where you can actually name a beneficiary after you pass away. And those states generally make it fairly easy to use that. But in most states, you cannot.
In Connecticut, you don't know?
I don't know for sure, but I don't think Connecticut's one of them.
Okay, thank you. Thanks.
A question about beneficiary designations? So the beneficiary designation isn't really, like, those designations of joint tenants and tenants in common are usually for the ownership of the asset, not on the beneficiary designation. So the question is, what's the one where if you die, half goes to the trust and half goes to the beneficiary? And on most accounts, when you designate a beneficiary, you get to decide how much you want to leave to which beneficiary, right? So if you leave it to a trust, you would decide how much. And if you leave it to an individual, you would decide how much. And some companies allow you to have backups, so successor beneficiaries, but some do not. So it just depends on, what they allow for and what they'll keep on their records. But if you have a trust, most of the time we run everything through the trust, because again, the trust will say who the beneficiaries are and what amounts and what they get. Yeah. Uh-huh. So if you have the person designated on your power of attorney is the person that you still want, then you don't have to cancel it. But if you do not want them anymore, then yes, you would need to cancel it. Because powers of attorney sometimes are automatically revoked when you do a new one. But even then, the institutions that know about it won't know that it's been revoked. So you have to tell them. So yes, generally it's best to actually cancel it if you want a different person named. Yeah.
I just have a question that looking down the pike with my husband may need long-term care. What's the best thing to do with the house? Keep it, sell it now?
Yeah, let's visit and talk about that. But you know, generally speaking, there are three options that make the most sense, right? One is positioning the house so that it's not affected by him receiving benefits and putting it essentially on your side of the ledger, because since you're not receiving benefits, then there's more flexibility to be able to keep assets, right? So that would be one strategy. The second strategy would be what we call spend down, which is, you know, essentially taking the value on, you know, if you were to sell it and putting it into situations that are not going to be counted so that we can keep it for the family. Or the third is, and again, depending on what kind of care and everything else, there are ways to be able to leverage the assets so that they cannot collect against it, because they end up taking, you know, an inferior position on the property, so they can't collect. But we can discuss, you know, specifics if you'd like. Yeah. Well, thank you guys so much for being here.